Go ahead and do it. Are you shy?
In the White Lotus dynasty, they tell you that blood is thicker than water. But they forget to mention that blood is a lot easier to drown in. My name is Zoraide Vance, and in a city of porcelain faces and ancient lineage, I was always the dawn that nobody wanted to see rise. To the Betrayals clan, I was a ghost story, the daughter of the man who tried to burn their world down. I spent years trying to scrub the scent of the docks off my skin, trying to be a good citizen in a country that saw my blackness as a permanent stain on their aesthetic. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I worked twice as hard and bowed twice as low, the mud wouldn't find me. I was wrong. Tonight, the shadows came to collect a debt I didn't sign for. They didn't want an apology. They wanted a sacrifice. So, I did the only thing a girl with nothing left to lose can do. I walked into the heart of the fire. I walked into the gilded root, drenched in the soul rain, and wearing the blood of the men who tried to break me like a second skin. I didn't go there to beg. I went there to force the king to look me in the eye. And when Kang Jae-hon, the Mud Prince himself, stopped the music with a single raising of his hand, I knew the dance had finally begun. Welcome back to the channel, family. If you're ready for a story where the outcast becomes the architect of her own empire, you are in the right place. We don't do usual here, we do legendary. Before we dive into the wreckage of the White Lotus, do me a favor. Smash that like button, drop the word Lotus in the comments to show your loyalty, and subscribe. You don't want to be the one left in the dark when the truth comes out. The neon pulse of the gilded root died so abruptly it felt like a physical blow to the chest. One moment, the room was a blur of expensive silk and heavy bass. The next, it was a tomb of silent, judging eyes. I stood at the entrance, the rain dripping from my braids onto the white marble floor, leaving a dark, jagged trail behind me. I knew what they saw. A foreigner, a glitch, a black girl who had no business breathing the filtered air of the elite. The racism in the room was thick enough to taste, a cold, clinical disgust that radiated from the men in tailored suits who looked at me like I was a smudge on a masterpiece. My life had shattered 3 hours ago in the narrow alleyway behind the pharmacy where I worked. I had spent years building a normal existence, learning the honorifics, mastering the language, and ignoring the way people clutched their bags tighter when I entered a subway car. I was the daughter of Elias Vance, the man who had dared to challenge the Betrayals' monopoly on the ports. But I had tried to be more than a daughter of a traitor. I was a student, a worker, a human being. But to the syndicate associates who cornered me, I was just a debt token. They had laughed as they told me my father's life was forfeit unless I served the clan's interests. The blood on my knuckles wasn't mine. It was the price of realizing that in Korea, you either own the mud or you're buried by it. Kang Jae-hon sat in a high-backed chair of black obsidian at the center of the VIP lounge. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a god who had become bored with immortality. He was the Mud Prince, the man who had survived exile only to return and dismantle his father's legacy with a smile that never reached his eyes. As I walked toward him, the security enforcers moved to block my path, their mirrored visors reflecting my bruised face and defiant eyes. Jae-hon raised a single long finger, and they vanished into the shadows as if they had never existed. He didn't ask me who I was. He didn't ask why I was covered in the blood of his men. He simply watched the way I didn't flinch, his gaze lingering on the copper wire I'd used to garrote the last man who touched me. In that silence, the debt of the dawn was finally acknowledged, and I realized that the man I had come to for help was the only one capable of taking everything I had left. Jaehon didn't rise to meet me. He remained draped across his obsidian throne, a predator who knew the exits were already locked. He watched a single drop of rainwater slide down my cheek, tracing a path through the dried copper of another man's blood, and for a moment, the only sound in the club was the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the cooling system. The silence wasn't empty. It was a weight, the kind of pressure that forces the truth out of a person's lungs. To the onlookers in the shadows, I was a curiosity, a dark anomaly brought in by the storm. But to Jaehon, I was a move on a board he had been studying for a decade. "You're a long way from the pharmacy, Zoraide," he said, his voice a smooth, dangerous velvet that made the hair on my arm stand up. He spoke my name with an intimacy that felt like a threat. "And you've left a mess on my floor that my cleaners aren't going to like. Your father's enemies are currently turning the city upside down looking for the dawn. They don't want to talk. They want to sell what's left of your lineage to the highest bidder in Manila." "Then let them try," I rasped, my voice cracking from the adrenaline and the cold. "I didn't come here for a lecture on my father's failures. I came here because you're the only person they're more afraid of than him." Jaehon finally stood, his movements fluid and precise, the light catching the silver lotus pin on his lapel. He walked toward me, the distance between us vanishing until I could smell the expensive cedar and the faint metallic tang of his power. He reached out, his fingers grazing the collar of my torn jacket, not with affection, but with the cold calculation of a man inspecting a new acquisition. "Protection in the White Lotus dynasty isn't a gift, Zora. It's an investment," he murmured, his eyes locking onto mine, searching for the moment I would break. "The elders want you dead to settle the score. My rivals want you as a hostage to leverage against me. If I keep you alive, I'm declaring that your life has more value than their tradition. That's a very expensive statement to make." He leaned in closer, his breath ghosting against my ear. "So, here are the terms of the cage. You stay in my penthouse. You don't leave without my shadow, and you don't speak to anyone I haven't vetted. To the world, you aren't the daughter of an enemy anymore. You are my consort. You wear my name like a brand, and you stay by my side until I decide the debt is paid. You will be the jewel in my crown that reminds everyone exactly who I took from the mud." The word consort felt like a shackle tightening around my throat. It was a golden cage, a way to keep me under his thumb while using my presence to insult every man who had ever bowed to my father. He was asking me to trade my freedom for a different kind of servitude, one that would make me the target of every ambitious snake in the syndicate. "And if I refuse?" I asked, though we both knew the answer. Jaehon stepped back, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips, a look that was sharper than any blade. "Then you walk back out into the rain, and I'll give the men at the door 5 minutes before I tell them where you're headed. But I think we both know you've always looked better in silk than in a shroud." I looked at his extended hand, the hand of the man who had been banished to a diner just like the ones I used to scrub. I wasn't just signing a deal, I was stepping into a prophecy. I placed my hand in his, the dark skin of my palm a stark contrast against his pale, lethal grip. The deal was struck, and as Jae-hyun led me toward the private elevator, I realized that being the king's consort didn't mean I was safe. It just meant I was the only person allowed to see the monster without his mask. The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and cold grey stone, perched so high above Seoul that the city lights looked like embers in a dying fire. Jae-hyun led me into a sprawling living area where the air was perfectly pressurized and smelled of rain-drenched cedar. He didn't call for a medic or a servant. He walked to a sleek, hidden cabinet and pulled out a first aid kit and a bottle of amber liquid. The transition from the violent energy of the club to this sterile silence was jarring, making the phantom itch of the blood drying on my skin feel even more heavy. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to a low leather chair. I sat, my body finally trembling as the adrenaline ebbed away. He knelt before me, a movement that felt dangerously out of place for a man of his stature. He didn't speak as he began to clean the scrape on my jaw with a damp cloth. His touch was clinical, yet there was a strange, vibrating tension in his fingers that didn't match the icy mask he wore for the world. "Why me, Jae-hyun?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the vast room. "There are 1,000 ways to insult my father. You didn't need to bring a glitch like me into your home to do it." He paused, the cloth hovering near my skin. For the first time, the mud prince looked at me, not as a debt token and not as a consort. He looked at me with a terrifyingly clear memory. "You think this is about your father? You think I'd waste a penthouse view on a man who's already rotting in a cage?" He set the cloth down and leaned back on his heels, his grey eyes searching mine. 10 years ago, in a rainy grey corner of Seattle, there was a diner called the Lotus Grill. I was a man who didn't exist, scrubbing floors until my knuckles bled, learning exactly how much the world hates a king without a crown. My heart skipped. The Lotus Grill. It was the diner next to the community center where I used to take my dance classes. I remembered the boy in the back, the one with the expensive eyes and the bruised spirit who never spoke to anyone. "I remember you," I breathed, the memory rushing back like a flood. "The quiet busboy. Everyone called you Shadow." "And I remember a girl," Jae-hyun murmured, his voice dropping into a register that felt like a secret. "A girl who was being treated like a ghost because she didn't look like the rest of the neighborhood. One afternoon, when the manager decided I didn't deserve a break, that girl sat on the back steps. She didn't know my name. She didn't know my father was the most feared man in Korea. She just saw someone who looked hungry, and she gave me half of her lunch without saying a single word." He reached out, his thumb grazing my lower lip, a touch that was no longer clinical. "The White Lotus dynasty is built on blood debts, Zoraid. But the world forgot that I spent my exile learning a different kind of currency. You gave a king his dignity when he was in the mud. Tonight, I'm just returning the favor with interest." The realization hit me harder than the men in the alley ever could. He wasn't taking me to hurt my father. He was taking me because I was the only person who had ever seen the man beneath the monster. I wasn't just his consort. I was his living reminder that he was human. But in the Baekryun clan, being human was a death sentence. As he stood up and offered me his hand to lead me to the guest suite, I realized the golden cage wasn't just for my protection. It was for him. The boardroom of the Baekryun headquarters was a tomb of glass and polished ebony, suspended over the Incheon docks like a guillotine blade. The air inside was chilled to a precise, uncomfortable degree, smelling of expensive tea and the stagnant breath of old men who had spent their lives trading in human misery. When the double doors swung open, I felt the immediate, violent shift in the room's pressure. I walked a half step behind Jae-hyun, dressed in a tailored suit of white silk that made my dark skin look like a defiant statement against their monochrome world. The elders, 6 men whose faces were maps of ancient, cruel histories, sat around the table, their eyes narrowing as one. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was a physical barrier. To them, I wasn't a guest or even a person. I was a contaminant. I felt the heat of their blatant, clinical racism. The way they looked at my braids and the curve of my nose with the same disgust they might show a crack in their precious porcelain. Jae-hyun, the eldest, a man whose skin looked like yellowed parchment, wheezed. He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed solely on the prince. You were summoned to discuss the port logistics, not to bring your domestic curiosities into the inner sanctum. This is a place of blood, not a zoo. Jae-hyun didn't flinch. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, his father's chair, and signaled for me to sit. It was a declaration of war. I sat, my spine a pillar of iron, meeting the eldest's gaze with a cold, unblinking grace that I had spent 24 years perfecting in the streets of Seoul. You speak of blood, Elder Moon, Jae-hyun said, his voice a smooth, lethal ripple. He leaned against the table, his hand resting casually on the back of my chair. But my father's era of blunt brutality is over. He saw Zoraid's father as a threat to be crushed. I see his daughter as a reminder that the Baekryong clan no longer needs to hide behind shadows and slurs to maintain its grip. She is a stain on the lineage of this room, another elder spat, his voice trembling with a prehistoric rage. A foreigner's brat, the daughter of a traitor. You insult our ancestors by allowing her to breathe this air. I didn't wait for Jae-hyun to defend me. I leaned forward, the white silk of my sleeves whispering against the ebony table. Your ancestors built this empire on the backs of people they thought were beneath them, I said, my Korean fluent and sharp as a razor. But the docs don't care about the purity of the hands that move the crates. They care about strength. I've survived your assassins, your reign, and your streets. If I'm a stain, it's because your world isn't clean enough to hold me. The room went so still I could hear the hum of the distant cargo cranes. The elders looked at me with a new kind of horror, not just because of who I was, but because I had dared to speak their language with more precision than their own sons. Jae-hyun's eyes flickered with a dark, triumphant pride. He looked at the elders, his smile a jagged edge. See? My father used fear because he lacked imagination. I use excellence. Zoraid stays by my side because she's the only thing in this city that hasn't been corrupted by your tradition. If any of you find her presence an insult, feel free to step out of the room. But remember, once you walk out, you don't walk back in. In that moment, the boardroom trial became a coronation. Jae-hyun wasn't just protecting me. He was using my very existence to shatter the old world. As the elders sat in stunned, hateful silence, I realized that the Mud Prince hadn't just brought me here to save me. He had brought me here to save me. He had brought me here to help him burn the throne to the ground. The aftermath of the boardroom felt like a cold sweat. The silence of the penthouse was no longer sterile. It was heavy with the residual vibration of the elders' hatred. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, my reflection in the white silk suit ghosting over the dark sprawl of Seoul. Behind me, I heard the soft click of a glass being set down. Jae-hyun was staring at the city, but his posture had lost the jagged, lethal confidence he'd worn like armor in front of the council. He looked weary, the weight of the Mud Prince title finally pressing down on his shoulders. "You shouldn't have done that," I whispered, turning to face him. "You pushed them too far. They won't just hate me now, they'll try to erase you for choosing me. They've been trying to erase me since the day I refused to break that boy on the docks," Jae-hyun replied, his voice a low, hollow resonance. He reached for the buttons of his slate-grey shirt, his fingers steady but slow. You think I brought you here as a shield, Zoraid? You think I'm using you to spite them? He unbuttoned the shirt, letting it fall open. My breath hitched in my throat. Across the center of his chest, marring the perfection of his skin, was a jagged, raised map of scar tissue. It wasn't the clean line of a blade or the neat puncture of a bullet. It was a brutal, ritualistic trauma, the kind left by a heavy chain and the father who wanted to ensure his son never forgot the price of mercy. It was the Lotus Dock judgment, burned into his very frame. My father didn't just banish me to Seattle, he said, stepping into the dim light so I could see the true depth of the damage. He tried to beat the compassion out of me. He wanted to leave a hole where my heart was, so he could fill it with his own rot. Every time I breathe, I feel the pull of this skin. It's a reminder that in this family, love is a liability and empathy is a death sentence. I walked toward him, my hand trembling as I reached out. I didn't stop until my fingertips brushed the edge of the scar. It felt like cold, hardened earth. For the first time, the man I thought was my captor, the man I thought was using me as a political pawn, dissolved. In his place stood the boy from the Lotus Grill, the one who had taken half my lunch because he had been stripped of everything else. We're the same, I murmured, my gaze lifting to meet his. They tried to bury me in the mud because of who my father was. They tried to bury you because of who you refused to be. You didn't take me to insult them, Jae-hon. You took me because I'm the only one who knows what it's like to survive the people who were supposed to protect us. Jae-hon didn't flinch from my touch. Instead, he leaned into it, his eyes closing as he let out a jagged, exhausted breath. The distance between the mud prince and the enemy's daughter vanished in the space of a heartbeat. We weren't a boss and a consort. We were two ghosts haunting the wreckage of a dynasty, realizing that the only way to heal a scar was to finally stop hiding it. I didn't take you instead of your father's head because of a debt, Zora, he whispered, his hand covering mine, pressing my palm flat against his heart. I took you because you're the only thing in this world that doesn't make me feel like I'm still drowning. The grand ballroom of the Schiller was a sea of champagne, hypocrisy and shimmering light. This was the poisoned gala, a diplomatic summit where the Bekrion clan shook hands with the very politicians they paid to look the other way. I stood at Jae-hon's side, draped in a gown of midnight velvet that clung to me like a shadow. To the ambassadors and their wives, I was a scandalous accessory, a black pearl plucked from the mud of the enemy. They didn't see the way I was scanning the room, my eyes moving with the frantic precision of a girl who had spent a decade surviving the back alleys of Itaewon. "Stay close," Jae-hon murmured, his hand a steady weight on the small of my back. He was playing the part of the perfect heir, nodding to dignitaries while his eyes remained as cold as a winter sea. "The air is too still tonight, Zora. My father's loyalists are watching for a crack in the glass." "It's not the loyalists you should be worried about," I whispered, my gaze fixing on the waitstaff moving through the crowd. The elite see service workers as furniture, but I knew better. I knew how a real waiter carried a tray, the specific tilt of the shoulder, the rhythmic step of someone who had done it for a 12-hour shift. In the corner of the room, near the ventilation intake, a man in a crisp white tuxedo was moving with a military cadence. Too stiff, too alert. He wasn't looking at the guests' glasses. He was looking at the air filtration sensors. I recognized the ghost walk of a shadow operative from the Isle of Ash. "Jae-hyun," I said, my voice dropping to a subsonic vibration. "The server by the east pillar. He's not carrying a tray. He's carrying a localized neuroaerosol." I saw that specific canister model in a black market catalogue 3 years ago. If he hits those sensors, everyone in this room stops breathing in 30 seconds. Jae-hyun didn't turn his head. He didn't cause a scene. He simply tightened his grip on my waist, his pulse quickening against my skin. Are you sure? I lived in the gutters they use as their playground, Jae-hyun. I know the smell of a strike before it lands. Within seconds, the Mud Prince signaled his silent enforcers with a microscopic nod. 2 men in suits intercepted the server before he could reach the vents, dragging him into the kitchens with a terrifying silent efficiency. The music never stopped. The champagne never stopped flowing. But as the operative was neutralized, I felt the eyes of the room shift. They weren't looking at me with disgust anymore. They were looking at me with fear. They realized I wasn't just a trophy. I was the king's eyes. Jae-hyun led me to the terrace, the cold Seoul air hitting us like a splash of water. He turned to me, his silhouette framed by the neon skyline. He didn't thank me with words. He took my hand and pulled me into his space, his forehead resting against mine. You saved the room, Zoraide, he whispered. And you saved me. They think you're a liability, but you're the only one who can see the wolves because you've spent your whole life outrunning them. In the distance, the sirens of the city wailed, but on the terrace, there was only the sound of our shared breath. I had crossed the line from being protected to being a protector. I was no longer the enemy's daughter. I was the failsafe of the White Lotus. The atmosphere in the penthouse changed the moment the heavy iron gates of the Isle of Ash swung open across the water. It wasn't just news on a screen. It was a physical shift in the barometric pressure of the city. Kang Dae-sung was out. The old dragon, the man who had built the Baekryun Empire on a foundation of crushed bone and absolute silence, had returned to claim his throne. The air in the living room felt thin, overpressurized, as if the walls themselves were recoiling from the ghost of the man who had once owned them. Jae-hyun stood by the window, his back to me, his silhouette a jagged shard against the morning light. He hadn't slept. The scar on his chest was lightly throbbing, a phantom pain triggered by the proximity of the man who had delivered it. When the door to the penthouse opened without a chime, it wasn't a guest who entered, it was a message. A high-ranking courier placed a black lacquer box on the table and retreated without looking up. Inside was a single rusted dock hook, the tool used for the Lotus dock judgment. He doesn't want a meeting, Jae-hyun said, his voice a low, vibrating rasp that seemed to come from the floorboards. He wants a ritual. He's calling for the debt of the Vance family to be settled in the mud. He's demanding I turn you over to the docks by midnight, Zoraide. He wants to prove that his son is still the obedient dog he tried to break. I felt the cold chill of the Isle of Ash creeping into my marrow. My father's sins were finally coming for me, dressed in the authority of a man who didn't recognize the concept of mercy. I looked at the rusted hook, a symbol of the ritualistic violence that had defined this dynasty for generations. The racial weight of it hit me again. To Dae-sung, I wasn't just an enemy's daughter. I was a foreign blemish that needed to be scrubbed from his docks to restore his version of purity. If you give me to him, the war ends, I whispered, walking toward Jae-hyun. I reached out, my fingers hovering near the sleeve of his shirt. The elders will fall back in line. Your position will be secure. You won't have to fight your own blood for a glitch like me. Jae-hyun turned, and the look in his eyes made my breath hitch. It wasn't the cold calculation of a boss or the weariness of a prince. It was the raw, unadulterated fury of a man who had finally found something worth burning the world for. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of my neck, pulling me into the heat of his space. "My father thinks he can still command the tide," Jae-hyun murmured, his eyes reflecting the black metal of the dock hook. "He thinks he can use you to fix the hole he carved into my chest. But he forgot one thing. I didn't survive the mud to become him. I survived it to replace him." He picked up the black lacquer box and threw it through the glass balcony door. The sound of the shattering pane echoed like a gunshot over the city. "Tell his messengers that the dawn stays with the king," Jae-hyun growled into the silence. "If he wants the daughter of his enemy, he'll have to walk through the fire I'm about to set. Tonight, the White Lotus dynasty stops being his. It belongs to us." The declaration was official. The line had been drawn in the broken glass. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, I realized that I was no longer a consort or a victim. I was the catalyst for the fall of a god. The rain at the Lotus docks didn't fall. It hammered, turning the industrial heart of Incheon into a landscape of slick iron and rising silt. We were trapped in the hollowed-out shell of Warehouse 4, the very place where the Baekryong clan had broken men for decades. Outside, the headlights of a dozen black sedans cut through the gloom like the eyes of deep-sea predators. Kang Dae-sung's guards were moving in. Men I had grown up fearing. Men who saw me as nothing more than a debt to be collected in blood. The air was thick with the scent of brine and old oil. I could hear the rhythmic clank of boots on the metal catwalks above, the sound of a ritual closing in. Jae-hyun stood in the center of the darkness, his silhouette a pillar of absolute, lethal stillness. He wasn't looking at the doors. He was looking at me. The mud prince reached into the small of his back and pulled out a sleek, suppressed handgun, the cold steel gleaming under the rhythmic pulse of a failing mercury light. He didn't hand it to me with the distance of a bodyguard. He stepped into my space, the heat of his body a defiant contrast to the freezing rain. He reached around my waist, his chest pressing against my back, and placed the weapon into my palm. He curled his fingers over mine, his grip an anchor that stopped the frantic shaking of my hands. "The light is going to go out in 10 seconds, he whispered, his breath a jagged caress against my ear. Through the fabric of his shirt, I could feel the map of scars on his chest vibrating with the force of his heart. "They think you're the prize, Zoraid. They think you're the weak point they can use to make me bow. They still see the girl from the diner who gave away her lunch because she was soft." He tightened his hold on my hand, guiding the barrel toward the shadows of the main entrance. "Show them that the dawn doesn't just rise, it burns. Kill anyone who tries to take you from me. Because I'm not letting the mud win this time. I'm not letting them turn you into a ghost to satisfy a dead man's pride." The lights shattered. In the sudden absolute void, the world transformed. I wasn't the enemy's daughter anymore, and I wasn't a glitch in their porcelain world. With Jae-hyun's body acting as my shield, and his voice acting as my conscience, I became the storm. I felt the displacement of air as the first guard breached the perimeter. Guided by the man who had survived the drowning of his own soul, I pulled the trigger. The recoil was a heartbeat we shared. The muzzle flash illuminated his face for a fraction of a second, no longer the bored god of the club, but a warrior king reclaiming his kingdom. We moved through the warehouse like a single shadow, a four-armed deity of vengeance. Every shot I fired was a scream for the years I had spent hiding, a final no to the men who thought they owned the air I breathed. In the crushing dark of the Lotus docks, the title was finally earned. I wasn't just his consort, I was his weapon. And as the last of his father's men fell into the silt, I realized that the only thing more dangerous than a monster was the woman he had taught how to hunt. The sun broke over the Busan horizon, not as a gentle awakening, but as a slow, golden conquest, burning through the industrial haze of the ports. The smell of salt and spent gunpowder still clung to the air, a reminder of the night the earth shifted beneath the Baekryong clan. On the central pier, the old dragon, Kang Dae-sung, stood surrounded by the remnants of his guard. He looked smaller in the daylight, his era of shadowed ritual and racial purity crumbling like dry silt. He looked at his son, then at me, standing side by side in the wreckage of his authority, and for the first time, the man who ruled by fear found himself staring into the eyes of a power he couldn't quantify. He didn't offer a final battle. The silence of the docks, now filled with workers who refused to lower their heads, told him the war was already over. With a ghost of a nod, a silent acknowledgement that the mud had finally birthed something he couldn't break, the old dragon turned and walked toward the waiting car that would take him into a permanent gilded retirement. He was stepping aside for a king who had learned to serve and a queen who had learned to strike. Jae-hyun reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine, no longer a shackle or a guide, but an equal anchor. We walked to the very edge of the pier, where the deep blue of the East Sea met the iron of the docks. The heavy velvet of my gown was ruined, stained with the salt and the struggle of the night, but I had never felt more radiant. The atmospheric freedom of the White Lotus wasn't just a policy, it was the way the air felt in my lungs, unpaid, unburdened, and entirely mine. The world is going to look at us and see a glitch, Zoraid, Jae-hyun murmured, his gaze fixed on the rising sun. They're going to see the mud prince and the enemy's daughter and wait for us to destroy each other. They still don't understand that the fire didn't consume us. It forged us. I leaned my head against his shoulder, watching the first cargo ship of the new era pull into the harbour. The workers on the deck didn't bow in terror. They raised their hands in a silent, respectful salute to the man who had promised them protection instead of a beating. I was no longer a ghost in the grid, or a secret kept in a penthouse. I was the new face of the Baekryong clan, a black woman standing at the helm of a Korean dynasty, a living testament that power without compassion is just a slow way to drown. Let them look, I replied, my voice steady and clear over the sound of the waves. Let them see that the dawn doesn't just belong to the sky. It belongs to the people who were brave enough to wait through the dark. We stood there as the city woke up, two survivors who had turned a cage into a throne. The White Lotus was no longer a symbol of blood debts and ancient hatred. It was a flower that had finally learned to bloom in the open air. As the tide came in, washing away the last traces of the night's violence from the pier, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't running. I was home.